Hello and welcome back to RPMbassy. Today we're doing a video on an album that is simultaneously really critically acclaimed, and if you look at all the reviews from when it came out and the sort of end of decade reviews, it's always mentioned as being one of the greats from the time it came out, but I never see people online talking about it, and it's a bit of a weird one because of that. It's 2010's Cosmogramma by Flying Lotus. So this came out on the 3rd of May 2010, and it was a pretty quick release. It came out 2 years after his previous album, his second album, and this was sort of one that he made kind of in response to the passing of his mother, and also his great aunt, who passed at a very similar sort of time. And you know, both musicians. He's kind of from a musical family. John Coltrane, for example, is his great uncle, and you know, those sort of, that kind of vibe that you kind of get from musical families, where there's almost this element of maximalism that you get, where I guess in a way, certainly I feel when you look at certain artists like Jacob Collier, he has this kind of maximalist approach to composition, and you kind of get this as well. And I think that's, for me, it feels very true from musical families, where they're almost all trying to outdo the previous generation. And I think this is a really good example of it. As I said, this was critically acclaimed when it came out. If you look at the reviews for it, it's pretty much 8s, 9s, 5 stars, you know, 80% plus, across the board. I don't think there's a single duff review for it. And it ended up on a ton of end of decade album lists and things like that. And yet, granted, you know, it's 16 years old now, but when you go and look online at sort of spaces discussing music, for me, I don't know, I feel this one is kind of almost weirdly underappreciated. So it's kind of a critical darling, but I don't know, it doesn't seem to get the love that I would expect to see for it. I do think it's one of those ones that's kind of had a hand in inspiring a lot of more recent music. You know, you look at kind of the progression from here, where you've got this really eclectic and aggressively jazzy at times kind of composition, and then you've got sort of the way that this kind of more modern movement of chill lo-fi beats and stuff, where they're kind of picking the bits and pieces they like from Jay Dilla and from this and from Bonobo and stuff, and it's all kind of amalgamating. And I think, you know, this, as I said, this definitely had a hand in it. Interesting one as well, for an album so weird, it actually did better in the UK than it did in the US Billboard charts, you know, the Flying Lotus's home country of the US. So this hit 60 on the UK charts, and I think 88 on the Billboard charts, which, I mean, either way, I think that's kind of remarkable performance for something that's kind of as a bit left field and not inaccessible, but it's you know, it's not a traditional album in the sense it's presented as this kind of space opera. And weirdly enough, my first thought when I went back and re-listened to this, my first thought was of Days of Future Past by Moody Blues. I don't know why, but there's something about it. Kind of it has that kind of pseudo narrative built into it, despite the fact that there's very little vocal runs on this. But it just kind of, it hit me that it feels like the intent was the same, making the two. So as far as it sounds, you know, this is essentially, if you're familiar with Flying Lotus, this is kind of par for the course for him. This is that kind of weird, wonky, sort of electronic jazz kind of vibe. You know, Stephen Ellison, Flying Lotus, has always been this kind of interesting artist, in my opinion, and you know, he kind of exemplifies that word, artist. It's not just a guy making music, he's making art. He's got an intent behind it. He's got a message that he wants to convey, but he also wants you to work for it. He wants you to put your time into it as well. And you know, this is no exception. You've got a few different features on here. Thundercat, you know, phenomenal bassist and vocalist. He's all over this in terms of bass work. That I think probably a good half of the tracks, if not more, are featuring his work, and they really does feel like in some of those songs like A Tale of Two Halves, where it's sort of Ellison and Thundercat kind of playing off each other, which is really cool. Tom York you've got on here, Ravi Coltrane as well, like tons and tons of like sort of interesting names that you wouldn't necessarily immediately think of when you were thinking of musicians, but actually like they really complement this work. So we'll get into a couple of tracks on here. They do kind of blend all together, which I think for this works really, really well. This is kind of a full work that you kind of, I think it's very difficult to pick out individual songs and say like that's kind of the highlight per se. Not that any of them are bad, you know, it's not a bad album, but the whole thing is the highlight in a way. But if I had to really sort of pick out the big ones, I think for a lot of people probably the song Zodiac Shit, that's a big one. Intro / A Cosmic Drama, I really like that. You know, it's called Intro, but it's the 4th track on the album. But that's where that kind of connection, where I really draw that kind of Days of Future Past kind of connection for me. That's where I really picked into that. And Drips / Anti-Sarp, that and Intro feel very, very connected. And those are kind of like, they almost like bookend the album, but you've got sort of pieces either side as well. So it's like a little mini bookend. It's kind of like, I guess, almost like a, that's your main act in between those two. With Thundercat on there with like actual vocals, that's a really good one. That's where that counterplay between the two of them really like shines, and it feels like they've almost this will sound like it's a negative thing, but I mean it as a truly positive thing. It's almost like they've composed 2 separate songs and then come together, and I really, really love that. Weirdly enough, like, I'm a big Radiohead fan, but weirdly enough, probably my least favourite track on here is And the World Laughs With You with Tom York. I think his voice is sometimes quite understated, you know, it's that kind of like high falsetto that he likes to do. And it does kind of get a little bit lost in this because there's so much going on in so many of these tracks where you've got like really textural sounds. And I think because the way the instrumentation is like quite chaotic at times, but he's such a clean and precise vocalist, you know, and his like notation is so on point that it kind of like he sort of gets buried a little bit. Perhaps it was intentional because a lot of the things on here, they feel very intentional. So it's one of those things, I think perhaps like if you go back and re-listen, you'll probably pick up different parts of his performance that aren't immediately apparent. As far as the presentation of this, obviously you've got that great kind of very simplistic but very like hand-drawn and kind of authentic looking cover art. This was sort of like a piece that was kind of taken from one of Flying Lotus's mentors. He has like an art mentor, and this was a piece from like a collection of works that he had. And then inside you've got this awesome like really intricate crazy stuff that kind of looks like sort of like hieroglyphs or something like that. It's very interesting, and there's so much to kind of like look at and go through, and it does kind of feel very fitting with the album. And same with the sleeves, so you've got the just the bits and pieces on the back there with the track listing, but then you also have these kind of like glyphs which are, you know, sort of progressive and sort of changing and very interesting. As for the albums themselves, the LPs themselves, they are just a fairly standard black vinyl, but you do have a pretty cool bit of artwork on the label as well, and they're all sort of different. So this is one that I would really say it shines as a piece to put on and like just kind of sit back and you're not even, it's almost like not an active listening thing, but you're also not doing anything else. You're kind of just letting it wash over you. This is a really good album for that. Obviously there are sort of some pastimes that I think a lot of people probably will associate this album with, that you know, if you partake, this is definitely one that will work with that as well. So yeah, if you haven't heard this, if you're not familiar with his work, highly recommend checking this out. I think it's, even if it's not the kind of music you're into, even if you don't care for that kind of hip-hop influence, that jazz influence, that ambient influence, I think it's undeniably interesting, and so I defy anyone to sort of like shy it off without finding something to come away and think about with it. So yeah, highly recommend it. It's pretty easy to get hold of as well. You know, copies are not that expensive, and it's you know, it was a widely accessible album. So yeah, definitely recommend going and picking this up, because it's just a really nice one to have. And you know, when the mood takes you, this is one of the best to kind of get that kind of feeling. So highly recommended.